it wasn't as long as we had thought it might go on. Police were definitely prepared as the Hells Angels and their associates.
A Hutchinson Hells Angels biker gang member.
In the shadows of American counterculture, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club has cultivated a fearsome reputation since its founding in 1948. While officially describing themselves as a group of motorcycle enthusiasts, their history tells a different story, one written in violence, blood, and prison sentences. From murder and extortion to drug trafficking and racketeering, these outlaw bikers have repeatedly found themselves facing judges, juries, and the long arm of the law. Let's examine some of the notorious Hells Angels, whose crimes earned them extended stays in America's prison system. Number 20. Maurice Mom Boucher, the Quebec Massacre Mastermind.
Boucher led the Nomads, an elite chapter of the Hells Angels. He got the nickname Mom because he was apparently like an overbearing mother. For a time, he seemed untouched.
The story of Maurice Mom Boucher represents perhaps the most brutal chapter in Hells Angels history. Born in 1953 in Kausascal, Quebec, Boucher rose from poverty to become Canada's most feared criminal kingpin. His childhood, marked by an alcoholic father and extreme poverty, created the perfect breeding ground for a future criminal. By 9th grade, Boucher had dropped out of school, becoming heavily addicted to drugs and alcohol. His criminal journey began with petty theft to feed his addictions, but it wasn't long before he joined the SS, a white supremacist motorcycle gang. This affiliation made him an attractive candidate when he later sought membership with the Hells Angels in Quebec. Once accepted, Boucher's rise within the organization was meteoric and bloody. In 1985, Boucher orchestrated what became known as the Lennoxville Massacre, where 5 Hells Angels members were summoned to a quiet town in Quebec's eastern townships, only to be slaughtered in what Boucher saw as a necessary civil war to create a power vacuum he could fill. Not content with this bloodshed, Boucher formed the Nomads, an elite division within the Hells Angels, where new members had to commit murder as an initiation requirement, guaranteeing no undercover officers could infiltrate his inner circle. When rival gang The Rock Machine murdered a Hells Angels associate in 1994, Boucher launched a retaliatory war that lasted 7 years and claimed more than 160 lives. One innocent victim was 11-year-old Daniel Desrochers, killed by flying debris from a car bomb. But perhaps most chilling was Boucher's order to murder 2 prison guards, selected at random to intimidate potential witnesses against him. Initially, Boucher beat the murder charges for the prison guards in his first trial, displaying a smug demeanor throughout the proceedings. However, justice eventually caught up with him. Operation Springtime in 2001 led to his arrest along with 138 other Hells Angels members. This time, Boucher was convicted of numerous murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. Even from behind bars, his criminal activities continued as he orchestrated a plot to kill mob rival Reynald Desjardins, earning him an additional 10-year sentence in 2015. Throughout his trials, Boucher behaved like a celebrity, seeming to relish his infamy. But his story ended not with a bang, but a whimper. Expelled from the Hells Angels while in prison, he died of throat cancer in July 2022, alone and abandoned by those he once led. Like Joseph Lancier, the Rhode Island chapter president who would follow him years later, Boucher's courtroom demeanor revealed a man incapable of showing remorse for the lives he destroyed. Number 19. Joseph Lancier, the Rhode Island shooting.
New tonight, the leader of the Rhode Island Hells Angels is in trouble with the law. Yet again, 28-year-old Joseph Lancier is facing new charges after an altercation at the Cadillac Lounge in
the Hells Angels clubhouse in Providence, Rhode Island became the center of attention in June 2019, when Joseph Lancier, the 28-year-old chapter president, fired a shot at prospective member Richard Steinino's car outside the building. Their ongoing conflict had reached a boiling point, with Lancier determined to prevent Steinino from joining the club's ranks. The bullet struck the passenger side of the vehicle, narrowly missing its occupant, all while children were in the area and a school operated across the street. CCTV footage from the Hells Angels' own security system captured the incident, providing damning evidence against Lancier. Police arrested him just 3 hours after the shooting. The following day, state police deployed a Bearcat armored vehicle to ram into the clubhouse to serve a search warrant, explaining they needed such force because the building was known to be reinforced against conventional entry methods. Initially facing charges of discharging a firearm when committing a crime of violence and assault with intent to commit murder, Lancia could have been sentenced to up to 61 years in prison if convicted at trial. However, in a surprising turn of events, he reached a plea deal with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading no contest to lesser charges of felony assault and carrying a gun without a license, the judge sentenced Lancia to 5 years in prison with 10 years of probation to follow. Additionally, he received a suspended 3-year sentence for a separate incident where he knocked out an off-duty bouncer at the Cadillac Lounge strip club while out on bail for the shooting case. A no-contact order was put in place, requiring Lancia to stay away from Steinino for 8 years. Despite the relative leniency of his sentence compared to what he potentially faced, Lancia's cold demeanor in court reflected the Hells Angels code: never show weakness, never admit wrongdoing. This same attitude would be mirrored in Adam Lee Hall's case, where defiance in the face of overwhelming evidence seemed to be the only acceptable response for a Hells Angel on trial. Number 18. Adam Lee Hall, the triple murder enforcer.
Hutchinson Hells Angels biker gang member Adam Lee Hall has been found guilty of killing 3 men from Pittsfield.
Adam Lee Hall's courtroom drama unfolded during one of Massachusetts' most notorious murder trials. As a sergeant-at-arms of the Berkshire County chapter of the Hells Angels, Hall orchestrated the abduction, torture, and murder of 3 men in August 2011 during Hurricane Irene. The primary target was David Glasser, a witness scheduled to testify against Hall in an upcoming case. Glasser's friends, Edward Frampton and Robert Chadwell, were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming collateral victims in Hall's determination to silence Glasser. The 4-week trial revealed Hall's shocking disregard for human life. According to testimony, Hall personally tortured the men before dismembering their bodies and burying them in a shallow grave. His ex-girlfriend testified that Hall had 3 guns stashed in a dog food bag the night of the murders, providing crucial evidence that helped secure his conviction. During the trial, Hall's defiance reached its peak during closing arguments. When the district attorney was explaining Hall's movements at the time of the victim's disappearance and killing, Hall erupted in the courtroom, cursing at the prosecutor and insisting he was 20 miles away from the victims. This outburst only cemented the image of Hall as a volatile, dangerous individual incapable of controlling his anger. After nearly 4 weeks of testimony, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts, Hall was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with charges of extortion, kidnapping, and intimidation of witnesses. As Judge C. Jeffrey Kinder read out the sentence, 3 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim, plus additional time for the other crimes, Hall stood emotionless, his face betraying no remorse for his heinous actions. Like Stephen Sanders, the San Diego chapter president, whose case would demonstrate a similar lack of remorse, Hall's behavior in court revealed the dark psychology that often accompanies membership in these outlaw motorcycle clubs. Number 17. Stephen Sanders, the San Diego kidnapper.
I'm in here for multiple cases. I'm in here for armed robbery with a gang enhancement. I'm in here for assaults. I'm in here for
San Diego's Hells Angels. Chapter operated under the iron-fisted rule of President Stephen Sanders until his criminal empire came crashing down in 2012. Sanders faced a mountain of charges that painted a picture of a man who used violence as his primary tool of control. His criminal resume included assaults, kidnapping, robbery, and even solicitation of murder when he felt threatened by potential witnesses against him. The most serious charges stemmed from Sanders's ambush of a group of partygoers in Pacific Beach, an attack that demonstrated his willingness to target civilians without provocation. His violence wasn't limited to rival gangs. Sanders seemed to view anyone as a potential victim. In another incident, he kidnapped 2 people for the benefit of a street gang, furthering the Hells Angels' grip on the San Diego area. When Sanders realized the weight of evidence mounting against him, He resorted to desperate measures, attempting to arrange the murders of several potential witnesses to prevent them from testifying. This plot was discovered by investigators, adding solicitation of murder to his growing list of charges. Eventually, facing the prospect of an even harsher sentence if convicted at trial, Sanders pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including robbery, assault with a deadly weapon, kidnapping, and solicitation of murder. Despite his guilty plea, Sanders displayed a stunning lack of remorse in court. During his sentencing hearing, he complained that he felt pressured to plead guilty and claimed he was being unfairly targeted by law enforcement. "I was definitely targeted by the law enforcement agency," he told the court. "These law enforcement officers are just flat out obsessed with trying to put the Hells Angels. The district attorney's office is biased against us." His attorney even attempted to withdraw Sanders' guilty plea, claiming new witness testimony had emerged. The court denied this motion, seeing it for what it was, a last-ditch effort to avoid consequences. The prosecution presented damning evidence, including audio recordings of Sanders planning his crimes, making his claims of innocence ring hollow. Sanders received a 25-year prison sentence, a substantial punishment that the district attorney's office described as a huge victory in getting a dangerous criminal off the streets. Throughout the proceedings, Sanders continued to defend the purity of the Hells Angels, refusing to acknowledge the organization's involvement in criminal activities despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Number 16. Jay Witt, the Nebraska Clubhouse Killer.
Prosecutors say 48-year-old Jay Witt will serve a mandatory 22.5 years in prison for killing William Furlong. Authorities say Witt was a member of the Hells Angels and Furlong was a prospective member. Both men were seen on video going into the Hells Angels clubhouse near 27th and J in July 2013, but only the convicted.
In July 2013, the Nebraska Hells Angels chapter became the scene of a deadly internal conflict when 48-year-old Jay Witt killed prospective member William Furlong inside the chapter's clubhouse. Security cameras captured both men entering the building, but only Witt emerged minutes later. When authorities later discovered Furlong's body, it was clear that a violent confrontation had taken place within the clubhouse walls. Witt initially evaded capture, stealing a Chevy Impala to flee the scene. Law enforcement tracked the vehicle using its OnStar navigation system, and members of the Metro Fugitive Task Force apprehended Witt near I-68 and 30th Street. When questioned about Furlong's death, Witt claimed he had acted in self-defense, though evidence suggested a premeditated attack. At the sentencing hearing, Furlong's widow delivered an emotional statement, urging the judge to look beyond stereotypes and see her husband as a human being whose death had devastated their family. She emphasized that despite his Hells Angels connection, William was first and foremost a husband, father, and friend whose life mattered to many people. The judge sentenced Witt to 30 to 40 years in prison, a substantial term that reflected the seriousness of the crime and Witt's extensive criminal history. Witt's case revealed the dangers that lurk within the Hells Angels organization itself, where conflicts between members can turn deadly in an instant. His cool demeanor during sentencing mirrored the detached attitude that many Hells Angels members display when faced with the consequences of their actions, a pattern that would continue with the Fresno murder case, where a targeted killing of a fellow angel would expose a wider criminal enterprise. Number 15. The Fresno murder silencing one of their own.
County. According to documents that were filed in court, 54-year-old Fresno Hells Angel Merle Hefferman was involved in the secret cremation of fellow member Joel Silva.
The 2014 murder of Hells Angels member Joel Silva exposed one of the darkest aspects of the motorcycle club, its willingness to kill its own members when they're perceived as threats. 3 high-ranking Hells Angels orchestrated Silva's execution: Fresno chapter president Brian Wayne Wendt, Santa Rosa chapter president Jonathan Nelson, and Russell Taylor Ott. Their collaborative effort to eliminate a fellow angel revealed the calculated violence that can exist within the organization's hierarchy. The plot began when the 3 men decided Joel Silva needed to be eliminated. Russell Ott lured Silva to Fresno under the false pretense that Silva needed to fight with Brian Wendt to resolve past issues between them. Believing he was heading to a confrontation that would clear the air, Silva arrived at the Hells Angels clubhouse in Fresno, unaware that he was walking into a death trap. As soon as Silva entered the building, Brian Wendt shot him in the head, executing him without warning or chance to defend himself. The aftermath of the murder revealed the conspirators' careful planning. The three men bribed their way into having Silva's body cremated at a funeral home, effectively destroying crucial evidence. However, their efforts to cover their tracks weren't entirely successful. When federal agents later investigated the Fresno clubhouse, they discovered bullet holes in the building's walls, physical evidence of the violence that had occurred inside. The murder investigation expanded into a broader FBI operation that uncovered a massive racketeering enterprise. The Sonoma County Hells Angels chapter, according to a 2017 indictment, had been involved in numerous serious crimes: racketeering, drug dealing, assault, obstruction of justice, and multiple murders. When the FBI raided the Fresno clubhouse, they seized multiple weapons, at least 10 motorcycles, drugs, and clothing items containing human DNA and blood. Ultimately, Wendt, Nelson, and Ott were all sentenced to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole for Silva's murder. Their case represented a significant victory for law enforcement in their ongoing battle against outlaw motorcycle gangs, demonstrating that even the most secretive organizations could be penetrated and brought to justice. Number 14. Kadir P., the Berlin charter leader. The streets of Berlin became the setting for one of Germany's most high-profile Hells Angels cases, when charter leader Kadir P. orchestrated the cold-blooded killing of Tahir O. in early 2014. The 26-year-old victim was attacked at a local bookmaker shop in what German authorities described as a kill contract, put out by Kadir P. himself. After a lengthy trial that became the largest biker gang case in Germany's history, a Berlin court delivered its landmark verdict. Kadir P. was found guilty of incitement and sentenced to life imprisonment for his role as the mastermind behind the murder. Judge Thomas Gross didn't mince words when describing the charter leader, characterizing him as antisocial and aggressive, and emphasizing his central role in organizing the deadly assault. The court's ruling extended beyond just Kadir P. 7 other Hells Angels members also received life sentences for their participation in the attack, highlighting the organized nature of the crime. Surveillance footage revealed that some of the attackers had concealed their identities with masks during the assault, showing their premeditation and intent to avoid identification. One attacker received a reduced sentence of 12 years after cooperating with authorities, providing crucial testimony that helped prosecutors build their case against the Hells Angels leadership. This cooperation would have been seen as the ultimate betrayal within the organization, where loyalty to the club is supposed to supersede all other considerations, including personal freedom. Kadir P.A.'s case demonstrated the international reach of the Hells Angels and the similar patterns of violence that emerge regardless of national borders. Whether in Berlin, Quebec, or California, the organization's leaders have repeatedly shown a willingness to use extreme violence to maintain control and eliminate perceived threats. Like Norm Cox and Rob Thomas of the Kelowna chapter in Canada, Kadir P. discovered that Hells Angels membership offered no protection from the consequences of orchestrating brutal acts of violence. Number 13. Norm Cox and Rob Thomas, the Kelowna Killers. The peaceful community of Kelowna, British Columbia was shattered in June 2011 when 2 Hells Angels members committed a brutal public murder. Norm Cox and Rob Thomas, both associated with the Kelowna Hells Angels chapter, attacked and killed 51-year-old Dane Phillips in a shocking roadside assault that began as a dispute between teenagers and escalated to deadly violence. The tragedy unfolded when Phillips, a father described by loved ones as warm-hearted and gentle, attempted to resolve a conflict between his sons and 2 teenagers associated with the Hells Angels. His peacemaking effort was met with unfathomable violence when Cox and Thomas, armed with a baseball bat and a hammer, confronted Phillips on a public highway outside Kelowna. Court records revealed that Thomas approached Phillips and his children aggressively, wielding the weapons while shouting threats and proudly declaring his Hells Angels affiliation. What followed was a savage beating, with multiple blows to Phillips's head that left him fatally injured. The attack occurred in broad daylight on a public road, demonstrating the attacker's brazen disregard for witnesses or consequences. During their trial, prosecutors emphasized that the attack was motivated by Cox and Thomas's gang connections, portraying them as enforcers upholding the Hells Angels' fearsome reputation through extreme violence. The judge characterized the assault as brutal and unwarranted, noting that Phillips had posed no threat and was merely trying to peacefully resolve a situation when he was viciously attacked. Both Cox and Thomas were sentenced to 15 years in prison for the killing, though their sentences were later reduced to 12 years due to credit for pre-sentence custody. Throughout the proceedings, they displayed the characteristic detachment common among Hells Angels members facing criminal charges, showing little visible remorse for destroying a family and taking a life over what began as a trivial dispute between teenagers. Their brutal attack on a man simply trying to protect his sons demonstrated how the Hells Angels' influence extends beyond inter-gang rivalries to threaten ordinary citizens who cross their path. Similar to Zane Paora Wallace, the prospect whose case would reveal another side of Hells Angels' violence, Cox and Thomas showed how membership in the organization can transform personal disputes into deadly encounters. Number 12. Zane Paora Wallace, The Prospect's Rage. In a heart-wrenching case that revealed the dangers of Hells Angels culture infiltrating domestic relationships, Prospect member Zane Paora Wallace faced justice for the tragic death of Jasmine Wilson, a beloved mother whose life was cut short by Wallace's brutality. Unlike many Hells Angels cases involving rival gangs or internal club discipline, this case exposed how the violent tendencies cultivated within the motorcycle club can spill over into personal relationships with devastating consequences. The courtroom during Wallace's sentencing was charged with emotion as Wilson's family delivered impact statements describing their beloved Jazz and the irreplaceable void her death had created in their lives. Security personnel had to maintain order as tensions between the families ran high, with raw grief and anger permeating the proceedings. Crown Prosecutor Chris Wilkinson Smith emphasized Wallace's history of violence and the need for a substantial sentence to protect society from further harm. The court heard chilling details of how Wallace, as a Hells Angels prospect trying to prove his worth to the organization, had subjected Wilson to prolonged physical abuse, culminating in her death. What made the case particularly disturbing was evidence suggesting Wallace had been groomed by the Hells Angels culture to view violence as an acceptable means of asserting control and dominance, traits valued within the organization's hypermasculine environment. Wallace himself addressed the court, acknowledging the gravity of his actions and accepting the life sentence imposed by Justice Francis Cook, who established a minimum non-parole period of 15 years and 6 months. The judge condemned the prolonged torment Wilson had endured, noting that the sentence reflected both the seriousness of the crime and the need to protect other potential victims from Wallace's violent tendencies. As the verdict was pronounced, emotions erupted in the courtroom, though security quickly diffused the situation before chaos could ensue. Detective Senior Sergeant Phil Taylor expressed relief for the Wilson family that the court process had concluded, hoping the verdict would provide some measure of closure for those grieving Jasmine's loss. Number 11. Brian Shane Henson, The Undercover Sting. Brian Shane Henson's fall from Hells Angels, enforcer to federal prisoner, began with a fateful negotiation in early 2017. The 42-year-old biker had no idea he was walking into a carefully orchestrated sting operation when he arranged to sell narcotics and firearms to what he believed was a fellow criminal. In reality, his buyer was an undercover ATF agent, gathering evidence for what would become a career-ending case against Henson. Alongside his co-defendant Hussein Eltarib, Henson drove to Needles, California to complete the exchange, confidently bringing illegal drugs and weapons to seal the deal. The moment they arrived, law enforcement officers moved in, arresting both men and seizing the contraband they had brought to the meeting. The sting operation had been flawlessly executed, catching Henson red-handed in the act of drug and weapon trafficking. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Henson made the difficult decision to plead guilty to distribution of controlled substances and trafficking in firearms. His plea carried severe consequences, a mandatory minimum sentence of 180 months, 15 years, in federal custody, effectively removing him from the Hells Angels organization and the criminal underworld he had operated in for years. The investigation that brought Henson down was a collaborative effort involving the ATF's Flagstaff office and various other law enforcement agencies determined to disrupt the Hells Angels' criminal activities. Their patient, methodical work paid off with the conviction of not just Henson, but also his accomplice Elterib, who received the same 15-year minimum sentence after being found guilty of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances and possession of a firearm in relation to drug trafficking. During his sentencing hearing, Henson maintained the stoic demeanor typical of Hells Angels members facing justice, but the reality of spending the next 15 years in federal prison clearly weighed on him. At 42, he would be approaching 60 by the time of his release, with his prime years spent behind bars rather than riding with his Hells Angels brothers. While Brian Shane Henson was caught red-handed by an undercover ATF agent in a sting operation that netted him 15 years for drug and weapons trafficking, his criminal exploits pale in comparison to the demonic appearance and sadistic violence of Caius Vaiovis, whose horrifying body modifications would be overshadowed only by the heinous nature of his crimes. Number 10. Caius Vaiovis, the devil incarnate.
Seething, Caius Vaiovis spat angry words at the jury after they found him guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and witness intimidation.
The Massachusetts courtroom fell silent as Caius Vaiovis entered, his appearance alone causing jurors to recoil in horror. With horn implants protruding from his forehead and 666 tattooed prominently across his face, Vaiovis had physically transformed himself into a walking nightmare. But it wasn't his demonic appearance that would condemn him. It was the unspeakable brutality of his crimes. Alongside Adam Lee Hall and David Chalou, Vaiovis stood accused of the 2011 abduction, torture, and murder of 3 men in Berkshire County: David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell. The primary target was Glasser, who was scheduled to testify against Hall in an upcoming criminal case. Frampton and Chadwell simply had the misfortune of being with Glasser when the killers arrived, becoming collateral damage in Hall's determination to silence a witness. The prosecution methodically presented their case, describing how the victims were kidnapped during Hurricane Irene, brutally tortured, and then dismembered before being buried in a shallow grave. Medical examiners testified to the extensive trauma inflicted on the victims, details so gruesome that several jurors visibly struggled to maintain their composure. Throughout the trial, Vaiovis maintained an unsettling demeanor, occasionally smirking during particularly disturbing testimony. Unlike his co-defendants, who occasionally showed cracks in their hardened exteriors, Vaiovis remained defiantly proud of his actions, never displaying a hint of remorse. When the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts, including 3 charges of first-degree murder, Vaiovis's response shocked even the most seasoned courtroom observers. As the judge prepared to deliver his sentence, Vaiovis erupted in an outburst that would become infamous in Massachusetts legal history. Judge C. Jeffrey Kinder, unmoved by the theatrical display, sentenced Vaiovis to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, the mandatory minimum for first-degree murder in Massachusetts. As court officers led him away in chains, Vaiovis continued to stare down the jurors, his modified face contorted in rage rather than the fear one might expect from a man facing eternity behind bars. Vaiovis's case represented the extreme end of violence within Hells Angels circles, but his individual savagery would be matched by the sophisticated criminal empire of Frank Hannabuth, whose influence extended across European borders and whose operations moved far beyond simple violence into a complex network of organized crime. Number 9. Frank Hannabuth, the European Godfather. The Spanish courtroom buzzed with international media as Frank Hannabuth, the towering former European leader of the Hells Angels, faced justice in what prosecutors described as one of the most significant organized crime trials in Spanish history. Standing 6 feet 4 inches, with broad shoulders and intricate tattoos visible beneath his expensive tailored suit, Hannabuth cut an imposing figure even in custody. The The German national had once ruled the Hells Angels empire across Europe with an iron fist before establishing what authorities called a criminal fiefdom on the Spanish islands of Majorca and Ibiza. Spanish prosecutors outlined Hannibeth's sophisticated operation, a criminal network that operated between 2009 and 2013, involving extortion, pimping, money laundering, illegal weapons possession, and violent robberies targeting wealthy tourists and business owners. Alongside Hannibeth stood dozens of alleged associates, many looking considerably less composed than their former leader as the charges were read aloud. Evidence presented included detailed ledgers of protection payments extracted from nightclub owners, photographs of luxury properties purchased with unexplained funds, and recordings of threatening phone calls made to business owners who resisted the Hells Angels' demands. Particularly damning was testimony about an elaborate prostitution ring allegedly operated by Hannibeth's organization, which prosecutors claimed had trafficked women from Eastern Europe to work in clubs controlled by the Hells Angels. Throughout the proceedings, Hannibeth maintained an almost regal composure, occasionally whispering to his legal team, but otherwise showing minimal reaction to the evidence presented against him. The charges against Hannibeth carried potential sentences totaling 13 years in prison and fines exceeding $4.5 million for criminal organization membership, money laundering, and illegal weapons possession. As the trial progressed, German authorities watched with particular interest, having previously struggled to successfully prosecute Hannibeth in his home country despite years of investigation. Hannibeth's methodical approach to criminal enterprise stood in stark contrast to the explosive rage that characterized Rodney Lee Rollness, whose violent response to perceived disrespect of Hells Angels symbols would lead to a brutal murder and eventually a life sentence. Number 8. Rodney Lee Rollness, the Deadly Enforcer. I was framed. The shout echoed through the U.S. District Court as Rodney Lee Rollness made his final desperate stand against justice. With his muscular frame, tattoo-covered arms, and the distinctive Hells Angels death head prominently displayed, Rollness embodied the intimidating image the motorcycle club had cultivated over decades. But now, facing life imprisonment for murder, his imposing presence was diminished by the shackles binding his wrists and ankles. You allowed paid informants to lie on your stand. This whole thing is a setup. Rollness continued, his face reddening with every word as Judge Robert Lasnik remained composed, assuring the defendant that he could appeal if he disagreed with the court's findings. The crime that had landed Rollness in this position was particularly brutal. In 2001, at a party in rural Snohomish County, Washington, Rollness had murdered Michael Santa Walsh for falsely claiming membership in the Hells Angels. For Rollness, such a claim wasn't merely dishonest, it was an unforgivable desecration of what he considered sacred symbols. Walsh's crime of falsely wearing Hells Angels colors had signed his death warrant in Rollness's eyes. For the murder of Walsh, Rollness and an accomplice had been awarded a filthy few patch, a macabre honor within certain Hells Angels circles signifying that the wearer had killed for the club. This patch, which Rollness had worn proudly on his vest, became damning evidence in the prosecution's case, demonstrating both his motive for the murder and the organization's approval of his actions. As Judge Lasnik pronounced the life sentence, Rollness's defiance finally crumbled. His shoulders slumped, and for a brief moment, the tough exterior gave way to the realization that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The conviction represented a significant victory in the government's efforts to combat outlaw motorcycle gangs, with law enforcement officials describing it as a step toward dismantling what they considered a dangerous criminal organization. While Rollness had killed to enforce the Hells Angels code, Jonathan Nelson would orchestrate an even more calculated murder, the execution of a fellow member who had violated the club's internal rules, proving that sometimes the greatest danger to a Hells Angel comes from within the organization itself. Number 7. Jonathan Nelson, the Santa Rosa executioner. The courtroom fell silent as Jonathan Nelson, the former president of the Santa Rosa chapter of the Hells Angels, stood impassively while the prosecutor described how he had orchestrated the execution of one of his own members. With his graying beard and weathered face, Nelson looked more like a tired businessman than a motorcycle club president capable of ordering a cold-blooded killing. But appearances, as the jury would learn, were deeply deceiving. Nelson had once wielded tremendous power within the Hells Angels hierarchy in Northern California. As president of the influential Santa Rosa chapter, his orders were followed without question, and his authority extended far beyond club business into various criminal enterprises that generated substantial profits for the organization. It was this power that Nelson wielded in 2014 when he decided that fellow Hells Angel Joel Silva needed to die. According to court testimony, Nelson had grown increasingly concerned about Silva's behavior, believing he had become a liability to the club through his reckless actions and loose talk. Rather than simply expelling Silva from the organization, Nelson concluded that a more permanent solution was necessary, one that would also serve as a warning to other members about the consequences of violating club rules. Working with Fresno chapter president Brian Wayne Wendt and fellow member Russell Taylor Ott, Nelson devised a plan to lure Silva to the Fresno clubhouse under false pretenses. The prosecution described how Nelson convinced Silva that he needed to travel to Fresno to resolve some issues with Wendt, assuring him that it would clear the air and strengthen his standing in the club. What Silva didn't know was that his death had already been decided. Nelson had arranged every detail of the execution, from ensuring Silva would arrive alone to planning the disposal of his body afterward. Phone records showed multiple calls between Nelson and the other conspirators in the days leading up to the murder, with location data placing Nelson in strategic planning meetings. Perhaps most damning was testimony from a former Hells Angels member who had decided to cooperate with authorities after becoming disillusioned with the organization's increasing violence. Throughout the 9-week trial, Nelson maintained the stoic demeanor expected of Hells Angels members, showing no emotion even as the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his guilt. As United States District Judge Edward J. Davila sentenced Nelson to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Nelson's sophisticated criminal operations in California stood in stark contrast to the smaller scale but equally illegal drug trafficking that landed Canadian Hells Angel Emery Pitt Martin behind bars, though both cases revealed the organization's deep involvement in criminal enterprises on both sides of the border. Number 6. Emery Pitt Martin, the veteran smuggler. In the quiet courtroom of Bathurst Provincial Court, 61-year-old Emery Pitt Martin appeared via video link, allegedly due to COVID-19 symptoms. A fitting final chapter for a man whose criminal career had been defined by keeping others at arm's length while he orchestrated major drug smuggling operations across Canadian provinces. The longtime Hells Angels member sat expressionless as Judge Denis LeBlanc delivered his sentence, 7.5 years in prison for drug trafficking and participation in a criminal organization. Martin's criminal history stretched back decades, establishing him as one of Canada's most persistent drug traffickers. RCMP investigators described him as a veteran Hells Angels member who had been affiliated with the organization since 1997 and specialized in smuggling narcotics from Quebec into New Brunswick. His arrest in 2018 was the culmination of a lengthy investigation that uncovered evidence of Martin's responsibility for importing a staggering 96 kilograms of drugs during just the summers of 2016 and 2017 alone. What made Martin particularly valuable to the Hells Angels was his extensive network of connections throughout Quebec and New Brunswick, allowing him to move large quantities of drugs while minimizing the risk of detection. He had perfected routes across provincial borders that avoided law enforcement checkpoints and developed relationships with corrupt officials who would look the other way in exchange for payments. The court heard how Martin had risen through the ranks of the Hells Angels to become a key figure in their Canadian operations precisely because of his reliability and discretion. Unlike some of his more flamboyant counterparts, Martin had maintained a relatively low profile, focusing on the business side of the organization rather than the violence and intimidation that often attracted police attention. Judge LeBlanc acknowledged Martin's time already served in pre-trial detention, 1,292 days since his 2018 arrest, and noted the harsh conditions of his confinement, which included extended periods in solitary and constant camera surveillance in his cell. These factors resulted in a reduction of his original sentence, though the judge emphasized that the severity of Martin's crimes demanded significant prison time. The prosecution countered by highlighting the extensive damage caused by Martin's drug trafficking operations, describing him as a key figure in a criminal network that had brought addiction and violence to communities across New Brunswick. Evidence presented included financial records, surveillance photographs, and testimony from other individuals arrested in connection with the operation who had agreed to cooperate with authorities. As Martin's video feed was disconnected following the sentencing, the court proceedings concluded without drama or outbursts. A surprisingly quiet end for a man whose criminal activities had spanned more than 3 decades. His methodical approach to drug trafficking in Canada would be mirrored on an even larger scale by David Giles, whose attempt to smuggle half a ton of cocaine into British Columbia would earn him the longest sentence ever given to a Canadian biker gang member. Number 5. David Giles, the record-setting smuggler. The atmosphere in the British Columbia Supreme Court was tense as 66-year-old David Giles, a veteran Hells Angel with decades of membership in the notorious motorcycle club, awaited the judge's decision. His weathered face, lined with years of hard living, betrayed little emotion as Justice Carol Ross prepared to deliver what would become a landmark sentence in Canadian legal history. Giles stood convicted of conspiracy to import and traffic 500 kilograms of cocaine, half a ton of the drug with a street value estimated at $15 million. The case against him had been built through an elaborate undercover operation in which police officers posed as international drug dealers, carefully gaining Giles's trust over months of meetings and negotiations. The sting operation culminated in 2012 when Giles and his associate Kevin Van Kalkeren arranged for what they believed would be a massive cocaine shipment to be delivered to a Burnaby warehouse. The exchange began with Giles' organization making a $14 million down payment to the undercover officers. When the supposed drugs arrived at the warehouse, police moved in, arresting Giles and several associates in a carefully coordinated takedown operation. Surveillance footage played during the trial showed Giles personally inspecting packages he believed contained cocaine, his experienced hands checking the quality of what would have been one of the largest drug shipments in British Columbia history. In recorded conversations, Giles could be heard discussing distribution networks and profit margins with the undercover officers, revealing the business-like approach the Hells Angels took to their drug trafficking operations. The judge then announced her decision: 18 years in prison for Giles, the longest sentence ever handed down to a British Columbia biker gang member. After accounting for time served in pre-trial custody, Giles would remain incarcerated for 11 years and 1 month, likely to be a life sentence given his age and deteriorating health. Giles' defense had argued for leniency based on his medical condition. He suffered from advanced liver disease and required a transplant, with his lawyer emphasizing that a lengthy prison term could amount to a death sentence given his health concerns. Medical records submitted to the court indicated that without proper treatment, Giles had a limited life expectancy. As Giles was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his stoic expression finally faltered, the reality of potentially spending his final years behind bars sinking in. His case sent a powerful message to organized crime groups in British Columbia. Even the highest-ranking members of outlaw motorcycle gangs were not beyond the reach of the law. While Giles faced his record sentence for attempted cocaine importation, another Hells Angel was facing the consequences for his role in a murder plot that had claimed the life of a fellow member, as Russell Taylor Ott discovered that loyalty to the club would not protect him from justice. Number 4. Russell Taylor Ott, the faithful executioner. The United States District Court in San Francisco fell silent as Russell Taylor Ott entered, his weathered face and graying hair making him look more like a tired tradesman than a member of the country's most notorious motorcycle club. At 69 years old, Ott was facing the culmination of a legal process that would determine whether he would spend his remaining years as a free man or die behind bars for his role in the murder of fellow Hells Angel Joel Silver. Unlike his co-defendants, Brian Wayne Went and Jonathan Nelson, who held leadership positions within the Hells Angels, Ott was what prosecutors described as a soldier, a loyal member who followed orders without question and whose dedication to the club superseded all other considerations, including the law. It was this unwavering loyalty that prosecutors argued had made Ott a willing participant in Silva's execution, despite having no personal grievance against the victim. According to the evidence presented during the 9-week trial, Ott had played a crucial role in luring Silva to his death. Phone records and witness testimony revealed that Ott had contacted Silva, convincing him to travel to the Fresno Hells Angels clubhouse by claiming that Silva needed to meet with Fresno chapter president Brian Wendt to resolve some lingering issues. Silva trusted Ott, believing him to be a friend and ally within the club, never suspecting that he was being delivered to his executioner. Throughout the trial, Ott maintained the stoic demeanor expected of Hells Angels members, showing no emotion even as the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his involvement in the murder conspiracy. His attorney attempted to portray him as a minor participant who had been pressured by higher-ranking members into assisting with the plan, but phone records and witness testimony painted a picture of willing involvement rather than reluctant compliance. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Ott declined, maintaining the Hells Angels code of silence even as he faced spending the rest of his life in prison. This silence, prosecutors argued, further demonstrated his continued loyalty to an organization that had involved him in murder. Judge Edward J. Davila sentenced Ott to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, emphasizing that while he may not have pulled the trigger, his role in the murder conspiracy was essential to its success. As court officers led Ott away in handcuffs, the elderly Hells Angel finally showed a flicker of emotion, a momentary widening of the eyes as the reality of dying in prison settled upon him. His case served as a stark warning about the consequences of unwavering loyalty to a criminal organization, a lesson that James Henry McCauley Jr. would also learn as he faced justice for decades of drug trafficking under the Hells Angels banner. Number 3. James Henry McCauley, Jr., the aging kingpin. At 67 years old, James Henry McCauley Jr. had spent more of his life as a criminal than as a law-abiding citizen. The former high-ranking member of the Rochester Hells Angels chapter stood before Judge Charles J. Siragusa in federal court, his once imposing frame now diminished by age and years of hard living. The courtroom was packed with law enforcement officials who had spent years building the case against a man they considered one of the most persistent drug traffickers in western New York. McCauley's criminal enterprise had operated with remarkable longevity, distributing narcotics throughout Rochester and the surrounding areas from 2002 to 2010. Using his connections and status within the Hells Angels organization, he had established a reliable supply chain from California, moving large quantities of drugs east and distributing them through a network of associates linked to the motorcycle club. What made McCauley's case particularly remarkable was his persistence. Even after being arrested on federal racketeering charges in 2007, he had continued to direct drug trafficking operations from behind bars, using coded messages and intermediaries to maintain control of his criminal network. This defiance of authority demonstrated both his commitment to criminal enterprise and his belief that he was untouchable. FBI wiretaps played during the trial captured McCauley discussing drug shipments in thinly veiled code, referring to cocaine as white paint and heroin as brown sugar. In one recording, he could be heard instructing an associate on how to test the purity of a cocaine shipment, revealing both his expertise in the drug trade and his hands-on approach to managing the operation despite his advanced age. The evidence against McCauley was overwhelming. Federal investigators had compiled financial records, surveillance photographs, wiretapped conversations, and testimony from former associates who had chosen to cooperate rather than face lengthy prison terms themselves. The case represented the culmination of a joint investigation involving the FBI, DEA, ATF, and local law enforcement agencies that had methodically dismantled McCauley's operation. With that, the judge sentenced McCauley to 300 months, 25 years, in federal prison. At his age, the sentence was tantamount to life imprisonment, a fact that seemed to register on McCauley's face as the reality of the punishment sank in. For the first time during the proceedings, his composed facade cracked slightly, a momentary widening of the eyes, the only indication of his distress. As McCauley was led from the courtroom in chains, the prosecution team exchanged quiet congratulations. The conviction represented the culmination of years of investigation and the removal of a significant figure in organized crime from the streets of Rochester. While McCauley faced decades behind bars for drug trafficking, another Hells Angel would find his freedom similarly curtailed after a routine traffic stop led to the discovery of illegal firearms, as Christian A. Rufino's case demonstrated the cascading consequences that can follow from a single mistake. Number 2. Christian A. Rufino. Downfall at a traffic stop. The unassuming streets of Cranston, Rhode Island, became the unlikely setting for the downfall of Christian A. Rufino, a 42-year-old former member of the New Rock chapter of the Hells Angels. What began as a routine traffic stop in December 2009 quickly escalated into a case that would send Rufino to federal prison for 15 years, providing a stark reminder of how quickly fortunes can change for those living on the wrong side of the law. Rufino's journey to prison began when a vigilant Cranston police officer pulled over his vehicle for a minor traffic violation. Something about Rufino's demeanor raised the officer's suspicions, leading to a request to search the vehicle. This seemingly routine encounter took a dramatic turn when the search revealed a loaded .38 caliber handgun under the driver's seat, additional ammunition in the trunk, and a small bag containing narcotics. The prosecution painted a different picture, arguing that Rufino's Hells Angels connections and extensive criminal history suggested the weapon was more likely related to ongoing criminal activities than simple self-defense. Assistant U.S. Attorney Richard W. Rose methodically outlined Rufino's prior convictions, emphasizing the pattern of violence and disregard for the law that had characterized his adult life. Judge William E. Smith, after considering the arguments from both sides, sentenced Rufino to 180 months, 15 years, in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release, the mandatory minimum for an armed career criminal under federal sentencing guidelines. The judge acknowledged the severity of the sentence, but emphasized that it reflected both Rufino's current offense and his extensive criminal history. As Rufino was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his face remained impassive, though the weight of his sentence, 15 years for a traffic stop gone wrong, was evident in his slumped shoulders. His case served as a stark reminder of the severe consequences that can follow even seemingly minor encounters with law enforcement for those with extensive criminal backgrounds and gang affiliations. While Rufino's downfall came from an unexpected traffic stop across the country, a Hells Angels chapter president was facing life imprisonment for a far more calculated crime: the cold-blooded execution of a fellow member who had violated club rules, as Brian Wayne Wendt would discover when the full weight of federal racketeering laws came crashing down on him. Number 1. Brian Wayne Wendt, the Fresno executioner. The federal courtroom in San Francisco hummed with tension as Brian Wayne Wendt, the imposing president of the Fresno chapter of the Hells Angels, awaited the jury's verdict. At 44, Wendt embodied the Hells Angels aesthetic, heavily tattooed, bearded, with hard eyes that had seen decades of violence. As chapter president, he had once wielded near-absolute power over his territory, but now he sat powerless as 12 jurors decided his fate. The centerpiece of the government's case against Wendt was the 2014 murder of fellow Hells Angel Joel Silver, a killing that prosecutors described as a cold-blooded execution carried out to maintain discipline within the organization. According to evidence presented during the trial, Silver had run afoul of club rules and was deemed a liability by the Hells Angels leadership, prompting the decision to eliminate him. FBI surveillance operations and wiretapped phone calls had captured Wendt discussing Silver in the days leading up to the murder, using coded language that investigators had decoded through months of careful analysis. The prosecution's case was strengthened by forensic evidence recovered during a raid on the Fresno Hells Angels clubhouse. Despite efforts to clean the scene, luminol testing revealed blood traces that DNA analysis later confirmed belonged to Silver. Bullet holes in the wall matched the caliber of a weapon registered to Wendt, further tying him directly to the killing. Throughout the trial, Wendt maintained the stoic demeanor expected of Hell's Angels members, showing no emotion even as former associates testified against him and damning evidence mounted. His attorney attempted to create reasonable doubt by suggesting that the government's case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of cooperating witnesses who had their own motivations for implicating Wendt. Despite these arguments, the jury found the evidence compelling, returning after 3 days of deliberation with a guilty verdict on charges of murder in aid of racketeering, a federal charge that carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment. As the verdict was read, Wendt remained expressionless, his only reaction a slight tightening of his jaw. United States District Judge Edward J. Davila sentenced Wendt to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crime and Wendt's position of leadership within the Hells Angels.